Poles and the bandits, you'll eventually arrive at a small village a few miles from the border with Laos called Loeng Nok Tha. By the time you get there, you'll know what to expect of the average Thai village because you'll have been through plenty of them. A couple of dozen wooden houses, a monastery with its shaven-headed Buddhist monks, and a Chinese store. You'll find all those in Loeng Nok Tha, and you'll find something else, something unique. During the past 3 years, the calm of the village has been disturbed by a presence that may surprise you as much as it must have surprised the Thais.
Head on to the market. The infantry up. Ready! Eyes! Ha! Engage! Hey! Ochogi.
The British Army. Not much of it, it's true, but enough to make a fair show on the parade ground. At a time when British units have been pulling out of Borneo with almost indecent haste, when discussions are held on how to reduce the cost of British garrison in Hong Kong, at a time when all the talk is of a British withdrawal east of Suez, it came as a surprise to this traveller at least to find a bunch of Tommies sweating it out here in the distant northeast of Thailand. The British government hasn't actually over-publicised their presence here, yet they're far from being new arrivals. Martial cries and the stomp of squaddy boots were first heard up here at the end of 1963. And since then, the local inhabitants have had the uninterrupted pleasure of their company. On days like this, the Thais have the unique opportunity to study two unusual cults, the British Army and the Church of England, operating more or less in harmony. Church parades, or indeed parades of any kind, are a rare occurrence at Loeng Nok Tha. Normally, everyone is much too busy to bother about bull. They're working furiously to complete by the end of the year the job they were sent here to do, to build an airstrip where there was only jungle. 2 months ago, 222 men of 34th Field Squadron Royal Engineers left Tidworth and arrived here to join a detachment of 54 Field Park Squadron on rotation from Singapore, plus units from REME and the Royal Corps of Transport. Together, they make up a workforce of 450 men. As well as the soldiers, there are 250 civilians recruited from surrounding villages working on the site. If you're wondering why economy-conscious Britain wants a £2 million airstrip in the middle of the Thai jungle, the official answer is she doesn't. And it's true that the whole installation has already been handed over to the Royal Thai Air Force. This being the case, you'd assume that since Britain and Thailand are both members of the South East Asia Treaty Organization, that the airstrip is some part of a SEATO plan. But apparently that's not so. It's the result of a bipartite agreement between Britain and Thailand. When I asked the commanding officer, Colonel Brown, why the strip's being built and why here, this is what he said.
Well, some time ago, several years ago, we offered the Thais various projects which we thought might be done in this area, and they chose an airfield in this part of Thailand. Northeast of Thailand is very undeveloped, and anything that can be done to open up communication is obviously a good idea. We wanted to build an airfield, it's very good training for sappers, and so we said we'd build them one here.
Well, now, what rights does the British government retain over the base to use it if and when it wants to? I understand it's to be handed over to the Thais, but presumably Her Majesty's government does have some rights over it.
I don't think it has any rights at all, no. It's a direct present to the Thais, and the Thais can use it as they wish.
There's no doubt that Britain's magnanimous gesture amounts to a fine piece of engineering. An airstrip 5,000 feet long with 500-foot overruns at each, giving it an effective length of 6,000 feet. An apron for parking aircraft, 1,800 feet by 300 feet wide, plus roads and taxiways amounting to 140,000 square yards or 500,000 tons of first-quality concrete. Enough to cater for the needs of a dozen troop-carrying Britannias at least. All this has been done since the beginning of the year, which leaves one wondering what everyone has been working at since 1963. The answer lies in a sad heap of asphalt rubble at the end of the runway. This was the first try. Penny pinching at the Treasury dictated an original design that was supposed to be quick and cheap. But even before it was finished, the monsoon rains got to work and it began to fail. 6 months after it was completed, they started to rip it up again and do the job properly. Let it be said once again that the new airstrip is a fine job, but not apparently good enough for the RAF. Not only have they no right to land here, they refuse to land here because there are no tenders or landing aids. Supplies for the engineers are flown to an American base 40 miles away and then ferried here by truck. But the Americans themselves have no such qualms. Several times a week, US Army transport aircraft are happily landing here with passengers and cargo. When you consider that Thailand is now the principal American base for operations against North Vietnam, one can be forgiven for wondering exactly what rights the Americans have to pursue their war from a British-built base. It's a question that I put to Colonel Brown.
They've no right to use it for any reason other than, shall we say, to assist the Thais. They have communications facilities which are Thai-American communications in the area. The only American aircraft that I know of using it so far are to bring in supplies and equipment for this communications network.
That American Communications Center, which Colonel Brown mentioned, is situated 30 miles away at Mukdahan. Security around it is strict, and it's impossible to say exactly what it's being used for. But it's a fair assumption that it has some part to play in US air action over Vietnam. Of course, the Royal Thai government has the perfect right to make whatever use of the British-built base it pleases. But some voices in Parliament might be raised in protest if it's used increasingly to support US action in Vietnam. But all these are political questions, quite outside the consideration of the Royal Engineers actually doing the work. The first shift of 60 men begins at 5 in the morning and carries on till 1 in the afternoon. The second shift takes over at 3 and works through and under arc lamps until 11 at night. It's hard, slogging labour under tough conditions. But for most of the men, it's a welcome opportunity to practice their trades they've been trained in. A welcome change from building bridges on Salisbury Plain and then knocking them down again. At least here, they can see something permanent as a result of their efforts. To fill their leisure hours, the choice of diversion is limited. For the truly masochistic, there's rugby or soccer played under a blistering sun on a ground almost as hard as that concrete runway. For the less foolhardy, the Royal and Ancient game provides surprises they'd never find at home. The greens are indistinguishable from the fairways, or from the bunkers for that matter. For those who don't like sport, there are film shows and tombola sessions, and a naffy canteen supplemented by a comprehensive comfort service provided by that unique British Army institution, that magnificent survival from the British Raj, the Charwala. Muhammad Gul is a Pakistani. His father and his grandfather served in the Indian Army. He himself followed the engineers from Singapore to Thailand, and presumably he'd follow them anywhere else, serving the same reliable char and wads and fractured army banter.
Free of charges.
Pardon?
Free of charge.
Yeah, free.
But despite all he can do, activities are still limited at Loeng Nok Tha, because the engineers can't stray far from the airfield. It's situated in a part of Thailand that's seen a good deal of communist terrorist activity in the past 6 months. And since the British carry arms neither on the base nor off it, they're encouraged to stay within its protective perimeter. Here, their security is provided by a small force of Royal Thai Air Force Guards. What would happen if there was a determined effort to sabotage the airfield doesn't bear thinking about, but probably the terrorists have other objectives in mind. The security problem will become much greater if the engineers stay on after the completion of their present task. I asked Colonel Brown whether it was assumed that they would go home once the airfield is completed.
Well, I'm afraid this is probably what we would do, and we would love to stay on and do all sorts of work in this area. There are very few roads. There's only one big road here, which you've seen, which is laterite and suffered on recently, I believe, from Mukdahan to Ubon. And we'd very much like to see a lot more roads built, of course. It's the sort of thing we'd love to do, too.
Whether the engineers do stay here or not will depend on a number of factors. Primarily on whether the Royal Thai government will bear part of the cost of the construction work. As far as the local villagers are concerned, it seems that the Thommies will be more than welcome. And they could certainly provide more for this part of Thailand than a flourishing laundry business. New roads are desperately needed, and at least the British government could be more or less certain that the Americans wouldn't be using them to mount assaults on North Vietnam. But the fact remains that despite the smiles, this part of Thailand is still far from secure. And the British government might feel very reluctant to push small construction teams into the jungle, where they might well become involved in Thailand's anti-communist war.